There's a mistake that makes any woman lose interest in a man, and most men make this mistake believing they're doing the exact opposite. They think that persistence demonstrates love, that chasing after someone proves worth, that being available all the time creates connection. But in practice, this slowly destroys what they most want to awaken: desire, respect, and emotional tension. And the most dangerous part, almost no one notices it while it's happening. Because neediness rarely presents itself as neediness. It disguises itself as good heart, effort, pure intention. But people don't respond to your intentions. They respond to the signals you transmit. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago when he said that human nature functions based on perception, emotional power, and behavior, not on idealized romanticism. And here's the counterintuitive part that almost no one dares to admit. The more a man pursues, the less valuable he seems. Because excessive pursuit communicates something silent: lack of options, fear of loss, and emotional dependence. Politics guided by reality, not ideals. A man who abandons his own life to try to win someone over without realizing it places the woman above himself in the emotional dynamic, and the moment that happens, the attraction begins to weaken, not because he's no good, not because he was too nice, but because he eliminated something essential: mystery, autonomy, and perceived value. The human brain doesn't desire what seems desperate for approval. It desires what conveys stability, direction, and genuine scarcity. And that's exactly why many men see women lose interest out of nowhere, without ever understanding the real reason. But the problem doesn't end there. Because while some men spend their time trying to convince women to see value in them, others awaken attraction almost naturally. And it's not just looks. It's not just money. There's a much deeper psychological logic at play behind it. An invisible pattern that Machiavelli would understand perfectly. Better to be feared than loved, as long as you're never hated. The emotionally respected man doesn't beg for presence. He doesn't humiliate himself for attention. He doesn't make a woman the absolute center of his existence. And ironically, it's precisely this man who usually awakens the most desire. In this video, you'll understand why chasing destroys attraction, how the human mind truly responds to emotional value, and what to do instead to become the kind of man who naturally attracts attention without having to chase after anyone. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. There's a stark difference between a needy man and a man considered dangerous. And no, dangerous here doesn't mean aggressive, cold, or cruel. It means unpredictable. It means someone who can't be easily controlled emotionally. Most men destroy their own value, trying to appear nice all the time, as if approval were a survival currency. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago when he spoke about the appearance of virtue. The man who begs for attention conveys weakness even before he opens his mouth. The man who has his own purpose creates a silent tension around him. And curiously, this tension attracts more attention than any desperate attempt to impress. Politics guided by reality, not ideals. That's the difference. Because in the real world, People don't respond to what you feel. They respond to what you demonstrate. A man who changes his entire routine because of a woman communicates that she has become the psychological center of his life, and that kills any perception of strength. The problem is that many confuse excessive availability with a demonstration of love. They don't realize that excessive presence eliminates mystery. And when the mystery fades, something within the dynamic begins to slowly die. The man considered dangerous is usually not trying to prove anything. He's busy building something. It could be his body, his career, his money, his discipline, his mind, or even his own silence. And that's exactly what creates magnetism. While many live chasing validation, he understands virtù and fortuna. He understands that luck favors those who build value silently. Notice how some people enter a room and immediately attract attention without even saying much. It's not just beauty, it's not just money, it's presence, it's posture, it's consistency between words and actions. A simple example. While an average man responds to messages in seconds, cancels appointments, and is always available, the strategic man keeps his own life in motion. He responds when he can. He has priorities. And that's not playing games, it's dignity. The end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve one's own psychological value, because whoever abandons their own mission to pursue someone else ends up transmitting emotional desperation, and desperation has never been an aphrodisiac. The hard truth is that many women aren't just looking for affection, they're looking for emotional stability, direction, and someone who seems emotionally solid amidst the chaos. And here's something almost no one talks about. The dangerous man isn't necessarily the most handsome in the room. Often he's the most centered, the hardest to manipulate, the one who knows when to leave. It's better to be feared than loved, as long as that doesn't mean being hated. Machiavelli understood that respect creates a more lasting force than momentary approval, and this also appears in relationships. The man who accepts everything, tolerates any behavior, and lives trying to please loses emotional authority without realizing it. The one who has clear boundaries creates a rare feeling these days, authenticity, and authenticity has become scarce. A brutal example of this appears on social media. How many men live trying to get attention by liking everything, commenting on everything, reacting to every story? They believe that persistence creates connection, but it usually creates predictability, and predictability reduces emotional tension. Decisions based on real human nature, not romantic fantasies, because attraction rarely stems from need, it stems from the perception of value. And there's a psychological mechanism behind this that almost no one deeply understands. There's a silent psychological rule that governs much of human attraction. People value more what seems rare. That's why someone might ignore something available for months, but begin to desire it the moment they realize the possibility of losing it. Desire is deeply linked to scarcity. Machiavelli understood this when he spoke about the appearance of virtue and how perception is worth more than intention. The man who is always available conveys an abundance of time and a scarcity of options. The man who has his own life creates a completely different impression, not because he's feigning disinterest, but because his attention is selective, and selectivity communicates value. Think of something simple. An empty restaurant almost always seems less interesting than a popular one. A very cheap product generates distrust. A rare invitation gains importance. The human mind associates difficulty with value, politics guided by reality, not by ideals, because in practice, people don't just respond to what they receive. They respond to the emotional effort required to obtain it. And that's where many men sabotage their own image without realizing it. When a man is constantly chasing after someone, he eliminates the psychological tension that sustains interest. Everything becomes predictable. Everything becomes guaranteed. And the human brain is rarely excited by what it already considers completely assured. This explains why some women show more interest precisely when a man starts focusing on himself. It's not manipulation, it's perception of value changing in real time. A man obsessed with approval hands over emotional power to the other person, and whoever gives away too much power usually loses attraction along with him. The end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve one's emotional position. Because insisting beyond what is necessary almost always communicates fear of loss, and constant fear conveys psychological weakness. A practical example of this appears in conversations. The insecure man tries to keep the conversation going at all costs. He sends several messages in a row. He desperately looks for topics. The self-aware man, on the other hand, understands something powerful. Silence also communicates value. He doesn't feel the need to fill every space. Virtù and fortuna appear precisely there, the ability to maintain presence without begging for attention. And few things today seem rarer than someone who is emotionally independent. Now observe something curious. Many women say they want a man who is available, but emotionally they connect more with one who seems to have his own direction. This happens because the human brain respects priorities. A man without a mission becomes emotionally dependent on the relationship to feel valued. And this creates psychological weight. A man who has goals, routine, discipline, and ambition creates a different feeling. He seems difficult to control. Better to be feared than loved, without ever crossing the line into contempt or arrogance. The strategic man understands that attraction doesn't just come from pretty words, it comes from the way he conducts his own life. A clear example of this is men who abandon the gym, work, hobbies, and friends when they start to like someone. Without realizing it, they communicate that their lives were empty before that person appeared. And this destroys emotional magnetism, decisions based on real human nature. Because people sense when you are trying to buy affection through excessive effort. And there is a specific behavior that transforms this desire into something even more destructive. Most men believe that pursuing someone demonstrates love, courage, or genuine interest. But psychologically, it almost always communicates something else, imbalance. When a man insists too much, he transmits an extremely dangerous silent message. He says, without realizing it, "You are worth more than me." And the moment this dynamic is established, the relationship ceases to be a balanced exchange and begins to turn into an unequal emotional negotiation. Machiavelli deeply understood real human nature. People rarely value what they already know they possess completely. The man who lives chasing eliminates the necessary space for curiosity, doubt, and emotional tension. Everything becomes predictable, everything becomes too easy, and when there is no more uncertainty, desire begins to slowly die. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, because exaggerated romanticism often ignores how the human brain really works. A man who sends unanswered messages, insists after clear rejections, and lives trying to convince someone to like him is communicating something serious, a lack of options. And a scarcity of options instantly reduces perceived value. There's another, even more destructive detail. Constant pursuit places the woman in a position of absolute psychological power. Without realizing it, the man relinquishes emotional control of his own stability. His mood depends on her response. His self-esteem depends on her attention. His peace depends on her validation. And no healthy relationship survives when one side becomes emotionally dependent on the other. The end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve one's own dignity. Because insisting beyond the limit rarely generates love. It usually generates wear and tear. A very common example of this appears when a man completely reorganizes his life because of someone who hasn't even shown equivalent investment yet. He cancels appointments, abandons goals, puts the gym aside, ignores friends, and begins to live according to that person's expectations. And then something curious happens. The more he tries to please, the less valued he seems, not because he's too nice, but because he conveys an absence of emotional center. It's better to be feared than loved, in the sense of never seeming emotionally hostage to anyone. A respected man doesn't beg for presence. He offers presence. There's a gigantic difference between the two, and perhaps the most brutal point is this: chasing eliminates mystery, and mystery is one of the strongest fuels of human attraction. When someone already knows exactly how you feel, exactly where you are, and exactly how you will act, the tension disappears. The human brain gets used to absolute certainties quickly. That's why many perfect men end up being forgotten, while others, less available, remain emotionally present in the person's mind. Virtù and Fortuna appear again here. The strategic man understands timing. He understands absence. He understands selective presence. He knows that perceived value depends on how he manages his emotional energy. A simple example: the needy man responds instantly to any crumb of attention. The conscious man, however, maintains focus on his own personal development. He doesn't abandon priorities because someone appeared. And this creates a rare feeling nowadays: psychological stability. Decisions based on real human nature, not on romantic illusions, because attraction doesn't grow through endless chasing. It grows when there is room for mutual investment, and there is a very deep reason why women value this game of emotional investment so much. There's a much deeper reason why women value courtship than most men realize. It's not just vanity, it's not playing games, it's biology, psychology, and perceived value working together for thousands of years. Since the most primitive times, women have needed to develop mechanisms to assess who is truly worth emotional investment. And this continues to happen today, even in a modern society full of filters, apps, and distractions. Machiavelli understood that human beings make decisions that are much more emotional than rational. Politics guided by reality, not ideals. Courtship functions as a silent test. It reveals patience, intention, stability, and above all, consistency. A woman rarely feels special when she perceives that a man offers the exact same energy to everyone. Exclusivity generates value, and value generates emotional investment. Think of something simple. When someone invests time, energy, and emotion in something, they automatically begin to value it more. This happens in business, friendships, money, and especially in relationships. The man who understands this stops acting like a desperate salesman trying to convince someone to like him. He learns to observe reciprocity before diving in emotionally. There's also a psychological factor called the IKEA effect. People tend to value more what they helped build, and this applies perfectly to attraction. When a woman feels she emotionally participated in the connection, investing attention, curiosity, time, and presence, the bond gains much more strength. The problem is that many men do all the work alone. They try too hard to impress, to please too much, to demonstrate too much, and end up robbing the woman of the opportunity to invest. The end justifies the means when the goal is to create a healthy dynamic of reciprocity. Because attraction doesn't just come from what you offer, it also comes from what the other person feels they built with you. A very clear example of this appears in conversations. The anxious man gives everything away too quickly. Total attention, total availability, total validation. The conscious man, on the other hand, creates space for real exchange. He shows interest, but doesn't stifle the interaction. He listens more, He observes more, and this generates an extremely powerful feeling: discovery. Virtù and fortuna appear again here. Knowing how to balance presence and absence requires emotional intelligence. And few things increase desire more than someone who seems emotionally difficult to decipher. But perhaps the most important point is this: courtship allows a woman to validate her own perception of worth. It's better to be feared than loved, in the sense of never losing self-respect by trying to buy approval. A woman wants to feel that she was consciously chosen, not that she became just a convenient option for a man desperate for female attention. And this completely changes the dynamic. The strategic man understands that he doesn't need to convince anyone of his worth all the time. True value is perceived through behavior, posture, and life direction. A practical example of this appears in men who have a strong routine, clear goals, and personal discipline. They don't need to say, "I am valuable." Their lives communicate this silently, decisions based on real human nature, because people observe signs long before they believe in words. And when a man understands this, he begins to apply much deeper principles of emotional strategy, principles that Machiavelli would perfectly understand within the dynamics of attraction. The first principle that completely changes how a man is perceived is simple: being respected is worth more than being liked. Most men try to be agreeable all the time because they believe this creates connection. But in practice, an excessive need for approval destroys emotional tension. Machiavelli said that it is better to be feared than loved, provided you avoid being hated, and this applies perfectly to relationships. A respected man has clear boundaries. He doesn't accept any behavior just to keep someone around. And curiously, this creates more attraction than emotional submission. A clear example appears when a woman repeatedly cancels appointments or shows obvious disinterest. The needy man insists, tries to compensate, and chases after her even more. The conscious man, however, perceives the signs and retreats with dignity. He doesn't create a scene. He doesn't beg for attention. He simply understands that reciprocity is indispensable. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Because people respect those who demonstrate emotional self-control, and self-control has become rare today. The man who knows how to say no conveys more strength than the one who lives trying to please everyone. Psychological respect always precedes lasting desire. The second law is brutally ignored by most. Strategy trumps brute force. Many men believe that persistence overcomes resistance. They think that quantity of attention creates emotional connection. But the human brain doesn't work that way. Excessive pressure usually generates distance. The strategic man understands timing. He understands social reading. He understands when to advance, and especially when to stop. The end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve his emotional position and his perceived value. A simple example of this appears in messages. The emotionally uncontrolled man responds instantly to any crumb of attention. The strategic man, however, maintains his own rhythm, not because he wants to manipulate, but because he has a life happening beyond that interaction. Virtù and fortuna appear precisely in this capacity for constant adaptation. Another important point: your social circle reveals your value. People silently judge the environment around them. A man surrounded by chaos, disorganization, and directionless people transmits this without realizing it. A man with strong friendships, a disciplined routine, and healthy environments communicates emotional stability. And emotional stability is extremely attractive in a world where almost everyone lives emotionally disorganized. The third, fourth, and fifth laws practically connect like a single gear. Excellence creates natural gravity. The man who is always evolving, body, mind, finances, communication, purpose, naturally attracts attention without needing to chase it. His own loyal armies. Machiavelli understood that depending too much on others weakens any position of power. And in relationships, this means something simple. Never make one person your only source of happiness, identity, or direction. A man without purpose becomes emotionally dependent too quickly. The man who builds his own life, however, creates a magnetic presence. A practical example? While many spend hours chasing attention on social media, the conscious man is learning new skills, training, reading books like The 48 Laws of Power, The Art of Seduction, or even Think and Grow Rich, developing communication and creating real value. And then comes the last law: act based on reality, not intention. Decisions based on real human nature. Because it doesn't matter how much someone wants to like you. What matters is how they react emotionally to your presence. People respond to signals, and when a man understands this deeply, he stops chasing and begins to build a life that naturally attracts. The biggest mistake most men make is believing that stopping the pursuit means not showing interest. That's not it. The problem has never been showing interest. The problem is abandoning one's own emotional dignity, trying to convince someone to see value in you. There's a huge difference between showing interest once and turning it into an obsession. The strategic man understands this difference quickly. Machiavelli spoke of constant adaptability, and few scenarios demand more emotional adaptation than relationships. Because insisting on someone who shows disinterest isn't persistence. It's emotional self-sabotage disguised as romanticism. Politics guided by reality, not ideals. A conscious man observes reciprocity. He clearly demonstrates interest, but also observes if there's investment from the other side. If there isn't, he doesn't force it. He doesn't beg. He doesn't create emotional speeches trying to convince someone to feel something. He understands that true attraction doesn't come from pressure. A simple example of this appears in dates. The balanced man calls once, creates an opportunity, manages the moment well, but doesn't desperately try to sell his presence. He knows that value doesn't need to shout. Consistent value is perceived silently. So what to do? Build a life so solid that relationships cease to be a need and become a complement. This is the point that almost no one understands. The man who lives emotionally empty transforms any female attention into a psychological addiction. The man who has a mission, discipline, and direction creates genuine scarcity. And genuine scarcity isn't a game, it's a natural consequence of a life occupied with important things. Virtù and fortuna appear precisely here. Emotional luck tends to favor those who don't desperately seek validation. An extremely practical example. While many men spend hours analyzing messages, creating theories, and waiting for answers, the strategic man keeps his routine intact. He trains. He learns new skills. He develops businesses. He strengthens friendships. He takes care of his appearance. He reads books that broaden his worldview. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The Prince by Machiavelli. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. All of this builds psychological presence, and presence is worth more than desperate emotional performance. The end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve your peace and your emotional position. Because those who are emotionally dependent on someone else's attention inevitably become manipulable. And perhaps the most powerful part is this: letting her invest as well. Many men believe they need to carry the entire interaction on their shoulders. They don't realize they're preventing the woman from developing curiosity, effort, and emotional involvement. It's better to be feared than loved, in the sense of never appearing emotionally available without criteria. The conscious man creates space. He doesn't suffocate. He doesn't try to control every step of the connection. He understands that people value what they helped build. A brutal example of this appears when a man stops chasing after clearly demonstrating interest. If there's reciprocity, the woman naturally begins to seek closer contact as well. If there isn't, he receives the answer without needing humiliation, insistence, or emotional strain. Decisions based on real human nature. Because signals matter more than promises. And emotionally strong men understand something few accept. Silent dignity creates more attraction than desperate effort. And this leads us to the psychological profile of the man who naturally inspires respect without needing to pursue anyone. The Machiavellian man isn't the one who manipulates everyone, as many imagine. In fact, he's almost always the man who has learned to control himself first. And that changes everything. Because emotional self-control creates an extremely rare presence nowadays. While many live reacting impulsively to neediness, jealousy, anxiety, and the need for validation, he operates differently. Machiavelli understood that true power is born from the ability to maintain emotional clarity in chaotic environments. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals. The strategic man doesn't build relationships to escape loneliness. He has already learned to live with himself. And this generates an almost magnetic tranquility. A simple example appears in everyday behavior. While many men panic when they perceive emotional distance, he observes the signs without losing his center. He doesn't beg for attention. He doesn't create drama. He doesn't make an emotional spectacle to try to regain control, because he knows that emotionally desperate people become easy to manipulate. And manipulable men rarely inspire true respect. The Machiavellian man understands that emotional stability is worth more than fleeting intensity. Another powerful characteristic: he is always building something. Always. The dangerous man rarely stands still emotionally or mentally. He has direction. It could be a project, a business, a strong physique, a new skill, or a financial goal. His own loyal armies. Machiavelli said that depending too much on external forces weakens any kingdom. And in the modern world, this means not depending emotionally on female approval to feel personal worth. The strategic man creates his own emotional foundation. A very clear example of this appears in his routine. While many live waiting for messages to feel alive, he maintains focus on his own evolution. He trains even when unmotivated. He works even when tired. He learns even without immediate recognition. And this creates an extremely different energy. Virtue and Fortuna appear precisely in this silent discipline, because most want quick emotional results, but few build true value in the long term. And curiously, women perceive this faster than men imagine. They observe consistency, they observe direction, they observe posture. A man without direction transmits insecurity even when he tries to appear confident. A focused man, on the other hand, transmits stability even when he speaks little. And perhaps the rarest trait is this: he knows when to leave. Better to be feared than loved, especially in the sense of never accepting emotional crumbs just to avoid being alone. The Machiavellian man understands something brutal. Whoever tolerates disrespect for fear of losing someone has already lost themselves first. So he doesn't prolong situations where reciprocity doesn't exist. He doesn't try to convince someone to value him. He doesn't insist on environments where he is clearly not wanted. The end justifies the means when the goal is to protect one's own emotional dignity. A clear example of this appears in modern relationships, where one side invests everything while the other offers only minimal attention to maintain emotional control. The average man remains there, waiting for change. The conscious man observes patterns, not promises, decisions based on real human nature. Because people show who they are through repeated behavior, and when he perceives a lack of reciprocity, he simply retreats without the need for revenge, humiliation, or emotional theatrics. And it is precisely there that the final paradox is born, which almost no one can deeply understand. There's an uncomfortable truth most men spend years trying to avoid. People respond far more to the signals you send than to your intentions. You can have the purest heart in the world, the best possible intentions, and still destroy your own attraction through your behavior. Machiavelli understood this deeply. The appearance of virtue often produces more social impact than silent virtue without presence. Politics should be guided by reality, not ideals, because at the end of the day, the human brain interprets attitudes, posture, energy, and repeated behavior. A man might say, "I am confident," but if he lives begging for attention, excessively apologizing, and accepting emotional crumbs, the signals tell a different story, and signals always win over words. A brutal example of this appears on modern social media. How many men try to appear good partners, but live emotionally available for any crumb of validation? They believe that excessive effort proves worth. They don't realize that excessive availability often communicates a lack of options. And a lack of options reduces the perception of emotional power. A conscious man understands that perceived value stems much more from how he conducts his own life than from the words he tries to use to impress someone. Another hard truth: attraction isn't won through pursuit. It's built through the continuous perception of value, mystery, stability, and emotional reciprocity. The man who relentlessly chases is almost always trying to compensate for something internally. Sometimes fear of loneliness, sometimes insecurity, sometimes a desperate need for approval, and women intuitively perceive this. Better to be feared than loved, especially in the sense of never seeming emotionally dependent on female acceptance to exist. The strategic man understands that the greatest psychological aphrodisiac is a well-constructed life. Virtu and fortuna appear again here, because emotional luck often accompanies men who are self-directed. An extremely clear example of this appears when a man stops living exclusively for relationships and begins to strengthen all areas of his own life. Strong body, organized finances, firm communication, disciplined routine, quiet ambition, loyal friends, peace of mind. Suddenly he stops conveying neediness and begins to convey emotional abundance. The end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve his inner value instead of destroying it trying to buy affection. And it is precisely at this moment that the dynamic changes completely. And then comes the final paradox that few men can accept at first. Those who don't pursue are usually more desired, not because they're playing psychological games, but because they convey something rare these days: emotional self-control. The man who doesn't beg for presence demonstrates that his life has meaning beyond that relationship, his own loyal armies. He has built his own emotional foundation. And this creates an extremely attractive silent force. A simple example: while many men despair after a breakup, he continues living. He continues evolving. He continues moving forward. He doesn't transform rejection into personal destruction. Decisions based on real human nature, because people sense when you are emotionally whole, and they also sense when you are trying to use someone to fill inner voids. The Machiavellian man understands that true attraction never stems from need. It stems from the natural consequence of someone who has learned to build value, presence, and direction. And ironically, the moment a man stops desperately pursuing, he finally begins to be perceived in a completely different way. Now, the most important question isn't whether any woman has ever lost interest in you. The real question is, How many times have you lost yourself trying to prevent that? How many times have you given up your own peace, your own dignity, and even your own direction just to try to be chosen by someone? Because this is the invisible game that silently destroys many men. They spend years trying to learn how to win women over, when in reality they should be learning how to build inner value, emotional stability, and self-respect. Machiavelli understood something brutal about human nature. People follow emotional strength, not emotional despair. And emotional strength doesn't mean coldness. It means self-control. It means presence. It means never making another person the absolute center of your own existence. So from now on, stop chasing those who don't reciprocate. Stop trying to convince people of your worth. Start building such a solid life that relationships cease to be a need and become a consequence. Train your body, strengthen your mind, learn communication, develop ambition, surround yourself with strong people, create your own loyal armies. Because a man who has direction naturally exudes magnetism. And ironically, the moment you stop desperately chasing validation, people begin to see you in a completely different way. Decisions based on real human nature, not on romantic illusions that slowly destroy your emotional standing. And now I want to ask you a sincere question. Were you trying to build attraction or just trying to avoid rejection? Because there's a huge difference between the two. How many of your actions stemmed from authenticity, and how many stemmed from the fear of losing someone? Write it in the comments. I want to know which part of this video opened your eyes the most. And if you want to continue learning about human behavior, emotional strategy, Machiavelli, psychological power, and male development, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because most men will never understand these truths. But those who do understand begin to be seen in a way that they no longer need to beg for attention to exist.